What if I told you that the fate of nations once hinged on something as small as a peppercorn? That wars were fought, fortunes won and lost, and empires built or broken, all over the simple desire to make food taste better. It sounds unbelievable, but for centuries, the world's most powerful kingdoms were obsessed with spices. These tiny, fragrant treasures weren't just ingredients, they were the ultimate status symbol, a form of currency, and even a reason to cross oceans and conquer lands. Think about that for a second. The same cinnamon sprinkled on your morning oatmeal was once worth more than gold, sparking voyages that would redraw the map of the world. The story of the spice trade is a saga of human ambition on an epic scale. Picture this: daring explorers braving treacherous seas, merchants haggling in bustling markets from Venice to Calcutta, and kings scheming to control the flow of these precious commodities. Spices like cloves, nutmeg, and pepper weren't just about flavor, they were about power. Whoever controlled the spice routes held the keys to unimaginable wealth and influence. And the lengths people went to secure them, they'd make even the most ambitious modern business tycoon pause. Entire cities rose and fell based on who could dominate this lucrative trade. The aroma of these spices didn't just fill kitchens, it shaped the destiny of civilizations. But here's the twist: the spice trade didn't just change menus, it changed the world. It fueled the age of exploration, led to the discovery of new continents, and laid the foundation for the global economy we know today. The quest for spices connected distant cultures, for better or worse, in ways no one could have predicted. And the echoes of that era, they're still with us. From the foods we eat to the borders on our maps, the legacy of the spice routes is woven into the fabric of modern life. So, if you've ever wondered how something as simple as a spice rack could hold the secrets to centuries of drama, adventure, and world-altering events, you're about to find out. This is the story of how flavor shaped history, and trust me, it's a tale worth savoring. Long before ships braved the open ocean in search of fortune, spices were already weaving their silent magic across continents. Imagine caravan after caravan trudging through deserts and mountain passes, carrying sacks of aromatic treasures from the lush islands of Southeast Asia all the way to the courts of Europe. The roots of this trade run deep back to the time when the pyramids were still new. Ancient Egyptian scrolls tell of cinnamon arriving from mysterious lands, used not just to preserve pharaohs but to perfume their temples. And when the Romans threw their legendary feasts, no dish was complete without a dusting of black pepper, so precious that it was stored like jewelry in locked spice cabinets. But how did these flavors travel such impossible distances? The answer lies in the greatest trading network the ancient world ever knew, the Silk Road. Though famous for silk, this web of overland routes was just as vital for spices. Merchants from Arabia, Persia, and India acted as middlemen, passing cinnamon, cardamom, and ginger from one caravan to the next like a centuries-long relay race. Meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean, monsoon winds powered housed those graceful wooden ships to carry spices from Indonesia to Africa's Swahili coast. Every transfer added to the price, turning a sack of peppercorns into something worth a king's ransom by the time it reached Venice. What made spices so valuable wasn't just their rarity. In an age before refrigeration, they preserved food and masked the taste of meat gone bad. Physicians swore by their healing powers: cloves for toothaches, ginger for digestion, nutmeg as a medieval antidepressant. And in a world steeped in superstition, spices were thought to ward off plague, tempt lovers, even summon angels. No wonder alchemists tried to recreate them in their labs. When Marco Polo returned from China with tales of trees dripping with spices, it wasn't just merchants who listened. Entire kingdoms began dreaming of controlling the source. The stage was set for an era of exploration that would change the planet forever, all because humanity couldn't resist the pull of flavor. Hidden among the turquoise waters of Indonesia, the Spice Islands were a well-kept secret for centuries until the world's superpowers caught wind of their treasures. These remote volcanic dots on the map, no larger than a few scattered pebbles, held something empires would kill for: nutmeg and cloves. Imagine a single tree's bark worth more than a sailor's yearly wages, or a handful of dried flower buds so valuable they could buy a house in Amsterdam. That was the reality in the Maluku Islands, where the air itself was perfumed with fortune. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to stumble upon this paradise of profit in the 1500s. Their ships, armed with cannons and ambition, carved paths through uncharted waters to reach these islands, but holding onto them that proved far harder. The local sultanates had traded spices for generations, weaving intricate networks with Chinese, Arab, and Indian merchants. The Portuguese tried to muscle in, building forts and demanding tribute, but their grip was slippery. Then came the Dutch, and they played for keeps. The Dutch East India Company, the world's first corporate superpower, saw the Spice Islands not as a trading post but as a private vault. They didn't just want a share of the nutmeg and cloves, they wanted every last seed. To achieve this, they turned the islands into a fortress of monopoly. Indigenous growers were forced to burn their own spice trees under threat of violence. Entire villages were wiped out to prevent smuggling. On the island of Banda, the Dutch slaughtered nearly 90% of the population, replacing them with enslaved laborers to tend the precious nutmeg groves. It was economic warfare disguised as trade, and it reshaped the islands forever. But why such brutality over something we sprinkle on eggnog today? Because in that era, controlling the Spice Islands meant controlling the global economy. A single Dutch ship laden with nutmeg could repay its voyage 10 times over. Kings and investors gambled entire fortunes on these voyages, and the Dutch weren't about to let rivals like the English or Spanish cut into their profits. They even went so far as to drench imported spices in lime to ruin them, ensuring no one else could resell their goods. The message was clear: this wasn't business, it was empire building by any means necessary. Yet the real tragedy lies in what was lost. The Spice Islands weren't just plantations, they were home to cultures that had cultivated these trees for millennia. The Dutch erased ancient traditions, disrupted ecosystems, and left scars that still linger. And for what? Within a few centuries, nutmeg seedlings were smuggled to other colonies, breaking the monopoly. The very greed that made the islands priceless also sowed the seeds of their decline. Today, the clove-scented breezes still blow through Maluku, but the empires that fought so viciously for them are long gone, a reminder that no amount of wealth can outlast the tides of time. Picture a world where a pinch of black pepper could buy a week's worth of bread, where sacks of peppercorns were guarded like royal treasure, and where thieves risked their lives to steal a handful of these tiny, wrinkled spheres. Black pepper wasn't just a seasoning, it was power bottled in a jar. While today we shake it onto our meals without a second thought, in medieval Europe, pepper was so valuable that it was literally worth its weight in silver. Kings stockpiled it in vaults, apothecaries prescribed it as medicine, and merchants built fortunes trading it across continents. The heart of this pepper frenzy lay along India's Malabar coast, where the humid air clung to sprawling vines heavy with green peppercorns. Workers harvested them by hand, drying them in the sun until they turned black and wrinkled, each one a tiny time capsule of flavor and fortune. From there, the pepper began an incredible journey. Arab traders carried it across the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea, where Venetian merchants waited like spiders in a web, ready to distribute it across Europe at staggering markups. By the time those peppercorns reached a noble's table in London or Paris, their price had ballooned to 50 times their original value. But why was pepper so expensive? Part of it was sheer logistics. The overland routes through the Middle East were fraught with danger bandits, shifting political alliances, and greedy middlemen all took their cut. Then there was the mystique. Pepper was believed to cure everything from constipation to the plague, and its fiery bite made bland medieval food palatable. But perhaps the biggest reason was status. In a world where wealth was displayed at the dinner table, a lavish sprinkle of pepper screamed prestige. When the Duke of Burgundy hosted feasts, his cooks didn't just use pepper, they showered dishes with it, as if to say, "Look how much I can afford to waste." Then came Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer who changed the game forever. Tired of paying Venice's exorbitant prices, Portugal bet everything on finding a sea route to India's pepper fields. In 1498, after months of brutal sailing around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, da Gama's battered ships finally reached the Malabar coast. The moment he stepped ashore, the balance of global power shifted. No longer would Europe rely on Arab and Venetian middlemen. Portugal's navy began carving out a pepper empire, seizing ports and bullying local rulers into exclusive trade deals. The profits were astronomical. A single successful voyage could repay its cost 60 times over. Yet Portugal's grip on the pepper trade didn't last. The Dutch and British, hungry for their share, muscled in with faster ships and sharper tactics. The British East India Company turned pepper into a corporate commodity, while the Dutch, never ones to shy from brutality, burned entire warehouses of pepper in the Spice Islands just to keep prices high. The irony, by the 18th century, colonial plantations had flooded Europe with so much pepper that its value plummeted. What was once a luxury for kings became a staple in every kitchen. But the legacy of pepper's golden age lingers. Those tiny black beads reshaped maps, funded empires, and even inspired the stock market. The Amsterdam Exchange was born from pepper speculation. Next time you reach for the pepper grinder, remember, you're holding a relic of history, one that once made nations bow and sailors brave the edge of the world. While the Silk Road might steal the spotlight in history books, the spice routes were the unsung heroes of global trade, operating like a shadow network of maritime superhighways. Imagine two competing delivery systems, one slow and land-bound, the other swift and ocean-powered, each vying to satisfy Europe's insatiable craving for flavor. The Silk Road, with its camel caravans snaking through deserts and mountain passes, moved luxury goods like silk and porcelain at a glacial pace, but spices. They demanded speed. A sack of peppercorns left moldering in a desert caravan could lose half its value by the time it reached market. That's why savvy traders bet on the sea. Ships could carry cargoes 100 times heavier than camels, riding the predictable monsoon winds like nature's express lane. From the moment cloves left the Moluccas or pepper was loaded in India, the clock was ticking. The maritime spice routes became a high-stakes relay race, with goods changing hands at a chain of bustling ports. Calicut on India's Malabar coast was the grand central station of spice commerce, where Arab dhows, Chinese junks, and later Portuguese carracks all jostled for dock space. Further west, Hormuz, a tiny island fortress in the Persian Gulf, acted as the ultimate toll booth, taxing every spice sack passing between Asia and the Mediterranean. Control these ports, and you control the spice trade's pulse. The Arab merchants who dominated the Indian Ocean routes for centuries weren't just traders, they were master navigators of both geography and diplomacy. They kept the locations of spice sources a closely guarded secret, spinning tales of mythical creatures guarding cinnamon forests to deter competitors. Meanwhile, Venice grew fat on the overland trade, its merchants paying Arab middlemen in gold and then marking up spices threefold for European buyers. This delicate balance held until the 15th century, when Portugal's Vasco da Gama smashed the system wide open by sailing directly to India. The fallout was immediate. Traditional overland routes withered as Portuguese cannons enforced a new maritime order. Yet the sea lanes had their own vulnerabilities. Pirates lurked in the Strait of Malacca, storms could wipe out entire fleets, and rival empires constantly schemed to seize choke points. When the Dutch captured the Banda Islands, they didn't just take the land, they took the wind patterns, forcing competitors to sail longer, deadlier routes. The British later one-upped them by inventing the fast, armed, T-clipper ships that could outrun both pirates and bad weather. What's fascinating is how these routes didn't just move goods, they moved ideas. The same ships carrying nutmeg also transported astronomy texts from Baghdad to Java, while Persian cooking techniques hitched rides on pepper sacks to India. Unlike the Silk Road's overland cultural exchange, the spice routes created a submerged network of influence, connecting port cities from Zanzibar to Guangzhou in a web of shared tastes and technologies. Today's globalized world owes as much to these forgotten sea lanes as to any desert caravan. The real spice trade wasn't just about flavor, it was the original internet, linking civilizations through the universal language of appetite. While the Spice Islands and Indian pepper fields supplied the goods, Venice became the ultimate middleman, turning geography into empire. Nestled like a jewel in the curve of the Adriatic, this floating city had no farmland, no mines, just canals, cunning merchants, and an unbeatable location. Picture the Mediterranean as a bustling marketplace. Arab traders brought spices from the east to Alexandria and Beirut, where Venetian galleys waited like taxis at a train station. From there, those precious cargoes sailed up the Dalmatian coast, slipping into Venice's labyrinth of waterways under the watchful eyes of customs officers. The city didn't just trade spices, it perfected the art of marking them up. A sack of pepper bought in Egypt could triple in value by the time it reached a banker's warehouse in Venice's Rialto district. What made Venice's spice machine so formidable wasn't just logistics, it was sheer audacity. The city's merchants operated like a cartel, fixing prices and bullying competitors. Their contracts read like spy novels, with coded language and secret clauses to outmaneuver rivals. The Venetian government even passed laws forbidding citizens from sharing navigation charts, ensuring no one else could replicate their trade routes. At its peak, Venice imported over 5 million pounds of pepper annually, enough to fill a fleet of gondolas. That pepper didn't just season food, it seasoned history. The profits funded St. Mark's Basilica's golden mosaics, paid for Titian's masterpieces, and bankrolled the city's legendary navy. But Venice's true genius lay in branding. They didn't just sell spices, they sold luxury. Saffron from Crete was packaged in silk pouches stamped with the Venetian lion, guaranteeing authenticity like a medieval FDA seal. Apothecaries near the Grand Canal blended exclusive spice mixes for wealthy clients, some containing over 30 ingredients. Even the city's infamous carnival masks hid a spicy secret. Many were perfumed with cinnamon and cloves, turning every masked ball into a walking advertisement for Venetian trade. The cracks in this empire began with an unlikely culprit, religion. When the Ottoman Empire seized Constantinople in 1453, they imposed heavy taxes on spice caravans crossing their territory. Venice's overland supply chain choked, forcing prices higher. Then came the Portuguese, who bypassed the Mediterranean entirely by sailing around Africa. By 1500, Lisbon's docks were overflowing with pepper shipped directly from India, no Venetian middlemen required. Desperate, Venice tried to sabotage Portuguese efforts, spreading rumors that Indian spices caused impotence. It didn't work. The final blow came from an unexpected direction: cookbooks. As spices became more accessible across Europe, their exclusivity faded. What was once a status symbol became commonplace. Venetian merchants, stubbornly clinging to old markups, found themselves sitting on warehouses of overpriced pepper, while the Dutch and English undercut them. The city that had once dictated terms to kings now watched as its galleys rotted in the lagoon. Yet Venice's legacy endures in unexpected ways. Next time you see a painting from the Renaissance, look closer. Those rich reds and golds, many were paid for by pepper. The very spices that built Venice's empire still linger in its art, a fragrant reminder that even the mightiest trade winds eventually change direction. The year 1498 didn't just change the spice trade, it rewrote the rules of global power. When Vasco da Gama's battered ships finally dropped anchor off India's Malabar coast, the world held its breath. For centuries, Arab merchants had guarded the routes to the east like a secret recipe, spinning tales of sea monsters and impossible distances to keep competitors at bay. But da Gama's voyage proved the impossible was just a matter of courage and cannons. Sailing around Africa's Cape of Good Hope wasn't just a navigational feat, it was a geopolitical earthquake. Suddenly, Europe had a backdoor to the spice markets, and the Portuguese weren't about to knock politely. What made da Gama's arrival in Calicut so explosive wasn't just the route, it was the raw ambition behind it. The Portuguese didn't come to trade, they came to conquer. Within years, their carracks floating fortresses bristling with guns transformed the Indian Ocean into a Portuguese lake. They seized Goa as their Asian capital, stormed the strategic port of Malacca, and strung a necklace of fortified trading posts from Mozambique to Macau. Each fortress wasn't just a warehouse, it was a toll booth, demanding taxes from every Arab dhow or Indian merchant vessel that dared to sail past. The message was clear: the old middlemen were fired. But the real revolution lay in the numbers. Before da Gama, pepper passing through Venice's hands could cost 60 times its original price by the time it reached London. The Portuguese cut out every middleman, slashing prices and flooding Europe with spices. In Lisbon's Ribeira Palace, clerks kept ledgers that read like treasure maps. One shipment from Cochin could fill the king's coffers with enough gold to fund an army. Yet this wasn't just business, it was brutality dressed as commerce. When the ruler of Calicut resisted Portuguese demands, da Gama burned alive hundreds of fishermen and hung their bodies from the masts as a warning. The fallout was instant and irreversible. Arab and Venetian merchants watched in horror as their centuries-old networks crumbled. Venice, once the spice trade's glittering queen, scrambled to adapt. Some merchants even disguised their ships as Portuguese vessels to sneak past patrols. Meanwhile, the Portuguese crown treated the spice trade like a state secret, punishing anyone who shared navigation charts with death. But the greatest tragedy unfolded in the east. The Portuguese didn't just break the spice monopoly, they shattered entire economies. Coastal cities that had thrived as trade hubs for generations withered almost overnight, their bazaars falling silent as the new sea lords rerouted history. Da Gama's voyage did more than open a route. It lit the fuse for 5 centuries of European empire building. The same cannons that guarded pepper shipments would soon enforce colonial rule from Brazil to Bombay. And the bitter irony, the man who sought to control the spice trade couldn't even stomach its flavors. Historical accounts describe da Gama grimacing at the fiery curries of Calicut, preferring bland Portuguese bread. Yet his distaste couldn't stop the avalanche he'd unleashed. The age of globalization hadn't just begun, it had been seasoned with blood and ambition, one peppercorn at a time. If the Portuguese played the role of ambitious newcomers in the spice trade, the Dutch rewrote the script entirely, turning commerce into conquest with chilling efficiency. By the 1600s, the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, wasn't just a trading firm, it was a corporate empire with its own army, navy, and license to wage war. Picture a business so powerful it could mint its own coins, sign international treaties, and even execute prisoners. This wasn't just about profit anymore, it was about total domination. And their weapon of choice, nutmeg, the tiny Banda Islands, a speck in Indonesia's vast archipelago, became the stage for one of history's most ruthless monopolies. Here, nutmeg trees grew like nowhere else on Earth, their fragrant kernels worth more than silver in European markets. The Dutch didn't just want a piece of this trade, they wanted it all. Their strategy was simple, brutal, and devastatingly effective. First, they burned every nutmeg tree outside their control, turning rival islands like Run into charred wastelands. Then they imposed quotas, forcing Bandanese growers to sell exclusively to the VOC at fixed prices. When local leaders resisted, the Dutch responded with a massacre so horrific it still echoes in the island's collective memory. The numbers tell a grim story. In 1621, Dutch forces slaughtered nearly 15,000 Bandanese, almost the entire population, replacing them with enslaved laborers from across Asia. Survivors were hunted down like animals, their villages reduced to ash. To ensure no nutmeg slipped through their grasp, the VOC even stationed soldiers on every beach, inspecting ships for smuggled seeds. And if that wasn't enough, they doused exported nutmeg in lime to ruin its quality, ensuring no competitor could resell it. This wasn't trade, it was economic warfare waged with a corporate logo. Yet the VOC's cruelty masked a deeper irony. Their obsession with control backfired spectacularly. In their haste to monopolize, the Dutch failed to notice when an English sailor smuggled nutmeg seedlings to Grenada, breaking their stranglehold forever. Meanwhile, the ecological toll was staggering. Entire forests vanished, replaced by monocultures that leached the soil. The Bandas, once a lush paradise, became a company town where every tree was counted, every harvest taxed. The VOC's legacy is a paradox. They built the modern stock market, pioneered corporate lobbying, and turned Amsterdam into a global financial hub, all on the backs of enslaved laborers and scorched earth. Their ships carried not just spices but the blueprint for today's multinational corporations. Yet their empire collapsed under its own greed, bankrupt by corruption and overreach. The nutmeg that made them rich now sits forgotten in kitchen cabinets, a bitter reminder that no monopoly lasts forever. The real spice wasn't in the seeds, it was in the audacity to think they could own nature itself. By the time the British East India Company planted its flag in India, the world's appetite had shifted, and so had the game. Spices still glittered in trading ledgers, but the real money now lay in leaves, not seeds. Tea, that humble brew that would become Britain's national obsession, was about to redraw the map of empire all over again. The British didn't just want a share of the trade, they wanted to own the very soil where the plants grew. And their strategy, a masterclass in economic alchemy, turning tea into silver, opium into cannon fire, and entire nations into company property. The story begins with an inconvenient truth. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to China. Every chest of tea shipped from Canton to London had to be paid for in hard currency, draining the treasury. The solution, a dangerous three-step dance. First, the British flooded India with opium plantations, forcing Bengali farmers to replace food crops with the addictive poppy. Then, they smuggled the opium into China against imperial decrees, creating millions of addicts. Finally, they used the profits from this illegal trade to buy tea, solving their silver crisis while poisoning a civilization. It was colonial economics at its most ruthless, and it sparked the infamous Opium Wars when China dared to resist. Meanwhile, in India, the East India Company operated like a shadow government. They didn't just control ports, they collected taxes, raised armies, and toppled local rulers. The spice trade still trickled through pepper from Malabar, cardamom from Kerala, but these were sidelines compared to the tidal wave of cotton, indigo, and opium. The company's warehouses in London brimmed with goods torn from Indian soil by indentured laborers, while back in Calcutta, shareholders grew fat on dividends stamped with blood. What's startling is how seamlessly the spice trade's playbook adapted to this new era. The Dutch had burned nutmeg trees to control supply. The British now burned entire cotton fields to manipulate global prices. Where Portuguese forts once guarded pepper routes, British gunboats now patrolled opium shipping lanes. Even the old Venetian trick of branding luxury held true, except now, it was Chinese tea leaves stamped with the East India Company's seal, convincing English housewives they were buying the real thing while cheaper smuggled tea flooded the docks. But the true legacy of this shift lies in its scale. Spices had made men rich, tea and opium made empires. The British didn't just dominate trade, they re-engineered societies to feed their machine. Indian farmers starved as opium replaced rice paddies. Chinese silver reserves evaporated like steam from a teacup. And all the while, the London Stock Exchange ticked upward, its fortunes tied to addictions and leaf quotas. The spice trade had been a scalpel, precise and brutal. This was a sledgehammer, crushing entire continents into the shape of profit. Yet for all their power, the East India Company's greed sowed its own downfall. Corruption scandals, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and mounting public outrage over the opium trade eventually shattered its monopoly. The British Crown stepped in, dissolving the company but keeping its blueprint. The age of corporate empires gave way to direct colonial rule, proof that when one system of extraction crumbles, another simply rises from its ashes. The spices that once fueled dreams of empire now gathered dust in London's warehouses, their scent fading beneath the sharper tang of tea and opium. The world had moved on, but the hunger for control. That never changes. Christopher Columbus never set foot in Asia, but his miscalculation changed the world forever. When he convinced Spain's monarchs to fund his westward voyage, he wasn't dreaming of new continents, he was chasing pepper and cloves. The maps he studied showed the Spice Islands tantalizingly close, just beyond what he believed was a narrow ocean. Imagine his shock when, after months at sea, his ships bumped into the Caribbean instead of the Moluccas. Even on his deathbed, Columbus insisted he'd found the outskirts of Asia, never realizing his mistake had unlocked a continent Europeans didn't know existed. The irony is almost too rich. The very spices that lured Columbus across the Atlantic were nowhere to be found in the Americas, at least not the ones he sought. But what the New World lacked in black pepper, it made up for in treasures no one anticipated. Chilies, vanilla, and allspice burst onto the global stage, transforming cuisines from Budapest to Bangkok. The Spanish, initially disappointed by the absence of Asian spices, soon realized they'd struck a different kind of gold. Mexican vanilla became the crown jewel of European bakeries, while Andean chili peppers traveled east along Portuguese trade routes, igniting culinary revolutions in India and Sichuan. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition took Columbus's gamble even further. When his fleet set sail in 1519, investors weren't funding a sightseeing tour. They wanted a shortcut to the Spice Islands that bypassed Portuguese patrols. Magellan's brutal journey through the strait that now bears his name cost 4 of his 5 ships and his own life, but the sole surviving vessel, the Victoria, limped back to Spain with a cargo so valuable it paid for the entire expedition. Its hold contained 26 tons of cloves, enough to buy a small kingdom. That staggering profit proved the Pacific could be crossed, and suddenly, every European crown wanted a piece of the action. What's often overlooked is how these spice missions became Trojan horses for empire. Columbus's voyages led to the encomienda system, where Spanish colonists enslaved indigenous populations to mine silver. Magellan's route became a highway for the Manila galleons, which shipped American silver to Asia in exchange for spices, creating the first truly global currency loop. The hunger for flavor had metastasized into something darker, a machinery of extraction that would bind continents together through force. Yet the most enduring legacy might be the accidental globalization of food. Before Columbus, Italian pasta had no tomatoes, Thai curries lacked chilies, and Swiss chocolate didn't exist. The spice race's detours created a culinary Big Bang, scattering ingredients across hemispheres like seeds in a storm. The peppers that once fueled conquests now sit innocently on pizza and in pho, quiet reminders that history's greatest accidents often end up on our plates. Beneath the glittering facade of merchant ships and fragrant cargoes, the spice trade ran on a currency far darker than gold: human lives. In the Moluccas, Dutch overseers worked enslaved laborers to death in nutmeg groves, their bodies buried beneath the same trees that lined European pockets. On Zanzibar's clove plantations, the air hung heavy not just with spice but with the stench of sweat and suffering, as men and women toiled under whips to meet insatiable demand. Even the soil bore witness. Forests that had thrived for millennia were torched to create monocultures, leaving ecosystems as barren as the promises made to those forced to work them. The true cost of those precious spices wasn't measured in guilders or pesos, but in blood. When the Portuguese took control of Sri Lanka's cinnamon trade, they enslaved the island's indigenous Kafirs, branding them like cattle to mark ownership. In the Banda Islands, the Dutch didn't just massacre locals, they imported convicts from across Asia, chaining them to nutmeg trees as living scarecrows to deter thieves. The cruelty was systematic, calculated. Planters knew a dead laborer could be replaced faster than a mature spice tree, so human life became disposable. Records from Dutch East India Company ships reveal horrifying math. A mortality rate of 1 in 3 sailors per voyage was considered acceptable, while enslaved workers in the fields died so frequently that their names weren't even recorded. Ecological devastation followed human suffering like a shadow. To maintain monopolies, colonial powers deliberately destroyed what they couldn't control. The Dutch burned entire nutmeg forests on islands like Run, ensuring no competitor could access wild trees. In Madagascar, vanilla cultivation required clearing rainforests so vast that local lemur populations teetered toward extinction. Even the spices themselves suffered. Centuries of selective breeding for yield over resilience left crops vulnerable to blights that would later wipe out fortunes. The irony was bitter. The very systems designed to maximize profit sowed the seeds of their own collapse. Yet the most enduring damage was cultural. Indigenous knowledge of spice cultivation, passed down through generations, was erased as colonial planters imposed foreign methods. In India's Malabar coast, traditional pepper-growing communities were displaced by British plantations, their intricate agroforestry systems replaced with sterile rows of cash crops. The Moluccans' sacred relationship with nutmeg, once woven into rituals and myths, fractured under the boot of commerce. Today, descendants of those communities still grapple with the legacy. Depleted soils, fractured identities, and economies built to serve distant masters long gone. The spice trade's darkest secret, its violence wasn't an accident, it was the foundation. Every pinch of cinnamon in a medieval feast, every nutmeg-studded Christmas pudding, carried the invisible weight of stolen lives and scorched earth. Modern food labels don't list these ingredients, but the traces linger in surnames from Suriname to Sri Lanka, in oral histories of resistance, and in the stubborn roots of spice trees that still grow wild among the ruins of forgotten plantations. The world may have moved on, but the ground remembers. What if your favorite dishes simply wouldn't exist without the spice trade? That fiery kimchi from Korea, the aromatic biryani of Hyderabad, even the humble apple pie, each owes its flavor to centuries of global exchange. The journey from royal treasure to pantry staple is a story of cultural collisions and culinary alchemy. Take chili peppers, those vibrant pods that set tongues ablaze from Mexico to Mumbai. Native to the Americas, they hitched a ride on Portuguese ships to Asia in the 1500s. Within decades, they'd transformed entire cuisines. Thai cooks, who'd once relied on peppercorns for heat, embraced chilies with such passion that today, it's impossible to imagine tom yum soup without their kick. Meanwhile, in Hungary, paprika, a spice born from dried New World peppers, became the soul of goulash, a national dish that defined a culture. But spices didn't just add heat, they rewrote recipes. Before cinnamon traveled from Sri Lanka to Europe, medieval desserts were bland affairs. Then came the revelation: sugar paired with spices could make even humble apples taste divine. The Dutch, masters of the cinnamon trade, capitalized on this, creating pastries so laden with spice they became status symbols. Over time, what was once a luxury trickled down to everyday kitchens. The same cinnamon that once graced the tables of Venetian doges now dusts morning lattes worldwide. Preservation was another revolution. In an era before refrigeration, spices like cloves and nutmeg were culinary lifelines. Their antimicrobial properties kept meat edible on months-long sea voyages, enabling explorers to sail farther than ever. The British Navy's love of salted beef spiked with pepper wasn't just about taste, it was survival. Even today, spice-heavy dishes like Moroccan preserved lemons or Indian pickles carry echoes of this practical legacy. Perhaps the most surprising twist is how spices erased borders. Turmeric, sacred in Indian rituals, colors Japanese curry. Allspice from Jamaica seasons Middle Eastern stews. Vanilla, once monopolized by Mexico, now grows in Madagascar and flavors French pastries. This blending wasn't always peaceful. Colonial plantations forced crops across oceans, but the result is a world where flavors refuse to stay put. Your spice rack isn't just a collection of jars, it's a living museum of human connection. Each sent a whisper of explorers, empires, and everyday cooks who dared to mix the unfamiliar with the beloved. The next time you reach for cumin or cardamom, remember, you're not just seasoning food, you're stirring centuries of history into every bite. The pursuit of pepper and cloves didn't just fill merchant ships, it built the very foundations of modern finance. Picture a 16th century Amsterdam tavern, where sailors and investors huddled over maps and ledgers, gambling fortunes on voyages that might never return. The spice trade's astronomical profits came with equally staggering risks. Storms could sink ships, pirates could plunder cargoes, and wars could shut down ports overnight. To spread that risk, merchants invented something revolutionary: the joint stock company. For the first time, even a baker or a blacksmith could buy shares in a spice voyage, turning ordinary citizens into stakeholders in global trade. The Dutch East India Company didn't just sell nutmeg. It sold the idea that capitalism could be a collective adventure. Insurance wasn't far behind. When a single shipwreck could bankrupt a family, savvy merchants in Genoa and Lisbon began pooling funds to cover losses. These early policies, scribbled on parchment in coffeehouses, evolved into the complex financial instruments that now underpin global commerce. Even the stock market traces its roots to spice speculation. The Amsterdam Exchange, where traders shouted bids for pepper futures, was the wild ancestor of today's Wall Street. The frantic buying and selling of spice contracts created something entirely new, an economy based not just on goods, but on the intangible dance of supply and demand. Yet the real game changer was credit. Spice voyages took years, requiring upfront cash for ships, crews, and cargo. Italian bankers like the Medici stepped in, offering loans with interest, a practice once condemned as usury. Soon, bills of exchange zipped across Europe, allowing a merchant in Venice to pay a supplier in Alexandria without a single coin changing hands. This web of trust and debt became the nervous system of global trade, proving that money could move faster than any ship. The Dutch East India Company's true innovation wasn't its spices, it was its structure. With a board of directors, annual reports, and even corporate branding, those VOC monograms stamped on every nutmeg sack, it operated like a modern multinational. Shareholders demanded transparency, forcing the company to standardize accounting practices that businesses still use today. But this corporate efficiency hid a dark side. The VOC was also the world's first megacorporation to wield private armies, enforce monopolies with violence, and manipulate markets. In many ways, it wrote the playbook for both modern capitalism and its excesses. What's fascinating is how these financial experiments rippled far beyond spices. The same systems that funded pepper caravans later bankrolled railroads and steel mills. The concept of limited liability, born from shipwreck spice ventures, now protects tech startups and pharmaceutical giants. Even the word salary comes from the Latin salarium, the allowance Roman soldiers received to buy salt, another precious commodity traded like spice. The scent of cinnamon may have faded from ledgers, but its ghost lingers in every stock ticker, every insurance policy, every startup pitch. The real treasure wasn't in the cargo holds, it was in the invisible machinery that made those holds possible, turning risk into reward and hunger for flavor into the engine of the modern world. Long before GPS or satellite maps, traders navigated the spice routes using the stars, the winds, and generations of hard-won knowledge. The incense route, stretching from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean, was one of the earliest and most legendary. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from the gnarled trees of Oman and Yemen, traveled by camel through deserts so harsh that missing a single water source could mean death. These aromatic resins weren't just for rituals, they were the lifeblood of kingdoms. The Nabateans, masters of this route, carved entire cities like Petra into cliffs, taxing every caravan that passed through their stone gates. Their wealth didn't come from the spices themselves, but from controlling the narrow corridors where geography forced traders to converge. Meanwhile, the Indian Ocean's maritime routes operated like a seasonal clockwork. Monsoon winds dictated everything. Ships sailed east to India from Africa between April and September, then reversed course when the winds shifted. This natural rhythm created bustling hubs like Zanzibar, where African ivory met Arabian perfumes, and Calicut, where Chinese silks changed hands for Indonesian cloves. The real power players, the Gujarati merchants of India, who built a vast network stretching from Java to Jerusalem. Their secret wasn't warships but trust, a reputation for honesty so strong that sultans and emperors relied on them as middlemen. But where there was profit, there was always conflict. The the Strait of Malacca, a narrow passage between Malaysia and Sumatra, became the ultimate bottleneck. Whoever controlled this 40-mile channel controlled the spice flow between China and Europe. The Srivijaya Empire held it first, taxing ships with impunity until the Majapahit of Java muscled in. Then came the Portuguese, who stormed the strait with cannon-laden carracks, followed by the Dutch, who burned rival ports to the ground. This tiny stretch of water saw more battles than some continents, all because of the cargoes it funneled: pepper from Sumatra, nutmeg from Banda, silks from Canton. Technology constantly redrew these maps. The invention of the lateen sail allowed Arab dhows to tack against the wind, opening new routes. The Portuguese caravel's deep hull could brave the open Atlantic, bypassing overland tolls. Even something as simple as the astrolabe, which measured star angles, extended the range of ships by hundreds of miles. Each innovation shifted the balance of power, lifting one empire while dooming another. Venice flourished when spices came overland through Egypt, but withered when Portuguese ships rounded Africa. The Ottoman Empire taxed overland caravans heavily, only to watch Europeans sail right past them. What's astonishing is how these routes mirrored the world's power struggles. When the Mongols unified Asia under Genghis Khan, the Silk Road became safe for spices and ideas alike. When Rome fell, the incense route crumbled with it. Even piracy played its part. The legendary Queen Zheng Yi Sao commanded a fleet of 1,500 ships off China's coast, extorting spice traders with such efficiency that the Qing dynasty finally offered her amnesty. And a retirement package. These routes weren't just lines on a map. They were living, shifting organisms, pulsing with the ambitions of everyone from kings to deckhands. A single storm near the Cape of Good Hope could send pepper prices soaring in London. A sultan's whim in Hormuz could starve Venice of saffron. Today, satellite-tracked cargo ships follow many of these same paths, carrying electronics instead of cardamom. But the lesson remains: control the routes and you control the world. The spices may have changed, but the game hasn't. The great spice monopolies didn't fall to armies or treaties. They were undone by gardeners and scientists. For centuries, empires had guarded their spice sources like state secrets, executing anyone caught smuggling so much as a single clove seedling. But by the 1800s, a new breed of adventurers emerged: botanical thieves. These weren't pirates with cutlasses, but men like Pierre Poivre, a French horticulturist who risked his neck to smuggle nutmeg and cloves out of Dutch-controlled Indonesia. Disguised as a trader, he bribed plantation workers to slip him live saplings, hiding them in hollowed-out bamboo tubes aboard his ship, his greatest heist. Establishing thriving spice gardens on the Seychelles and Mauritius, breaking the Dutch stranglehold with roots and soil rather than cannon fire. Meanwhile, the British were playing the same game. In 1812, a daring East India Company official named Henry Barham stole nutmeg seedlings from the Banda Islands, spiriting them away to Grenada in the Caribbean. The Dutch had drenched every exported nutmeg in lime to prevent germination, but Barham's stolen trees thrived in Grenada's volcanic soil. Within decades, the island became the Spice Isle, flooding Europe with cheap nutmeg and collapsing prices. The same Dutch merchants who once burned forests to protect their monopoly now watched helplessly as their empire crumbled, not from war, but from a handful of seeds planted in the wrong soil. Technology delivered the final blow. The invention of refrigeration in the mid-1800s meant food no longer needed spices to stay edible. Why pay a fortune for pepper to mask spoiled meat when iceboxes could keep it fresh? Suddenly, spices shifted from necessity to luxury, then from luxury to everyday commodity. The final irony: The very ships that once carried spices now transported ice. New England's frozen lakes harvested and shipped as far as Calcutta, a trade that would have been unthinkable in the age of sail. What's fascinating is how quickly the old order unraveled. The Dutch East India Company, once the richest corporation in history, went bankrupt in 1799. Portugal's spice forts became crumbling tourist curiosities, and the Venetian merchants who'd built palaces on pepper profits, their descendants turned to glassblowing and tourism. The world hadn't just changed, it had moved on, leaving the spice monopolies as relics of a bygone era. Yet the legacy of this shift is everywhere, that nutmeg dusting your eggnog. It likely came from Grenada, not the Banda Islands. The vanilla in your ice cream, probably grown in Madagascar, not Mexico. The spice trade's globalization, born from theft and ingenuity, made these flavors accessible to billions. The empires that fought so viciously to control them are long gone, but their final gift was an unexpected one. A world where anyone, anywhere, can savor the tastes that once toppled kingdoms. Imagine a war where the battle cry wasn't for king and country, but for pepper and cloves. That's exactly what happened when the Dutch and Portuguese locked horns in the 17th century. Their brutal decades-long conflict wasn't about borders or belief, it was about who would control the world's spice faucet. Portuguese forts from Mozambique to Macau became bullseyes for Dutch cannons, while merchant ships transformed into floating battlegrounds. In the Moluccas, the Dutch didn't just defeat the Portuguese. They erased them, burning their churches, renaming their forts, and rewriting history to claim the spice trade as their birthright. Then came the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a series of clashes that read like a corporate takeover gone violent. At stake, tiny islands most people couldn't find on a map. Take Run, a speck in Indonesia's Banda Archipelago. To the British, it was worth more than Manhattan literally. They traded it to the Dutch in exchange for New Amsterdam, now New York. Why? Because Run's soil grew nutmeg, and nutmeg was the ultimate status symbol. European elites grated it into their wine to show off, while apothecaries peddled it as a plague cure. The battles here weren't just about land, they were about controlling a global craving. Even the American Revolution had a spicy subplot. Colonists seethed as Britain's navigation acts forced them to buy overpriced spices from English merchants instead of trading directly with Caribbean or Asian suppliers. When the Boston Tea Party made headlines, lesser-known protests simmered over cinnamon and pepper. Smugglers ran Dutch nutmeg into New England harbors, while patriots boycotted British cloved hams. The rebellion wasn't just about taxation without representation, it was about flavor without monopolies. The darkest chapters unfolded in the Spice Islands themselves. When the Bandanese dared to sell nutmeg to English traders, the Dutch responded with a campaign of terror straight from a nightmare. Their soldiers herded villagers into huts and set them ablaze, a warning to anyone who defied the spice monopoly. Survivors were enslaved, forced to tend the very trees that had doomed them. This wasn't collateral damage, it was corporate policy, enforced with musket and torch. What's chilling is how ordinary these conflicts seemed to those waging them. Dutch generals wrote home about nutmeg yields in the same breath as troop movements. British captains carried not just muskets but ledgers, calculating how many pounds of pepper would cover their cannon expenses. Spice wars blurred the line between boardroom and battlefield, proving that profit could motivate armies as fiercely as patriotism. Yet the greatest irony, most soldiers dying for these spices had never tasted them. The sailors drowning off Malacca, the farmers conscripted into Portuguese armies, they fought for a luxury they'd never afford. The spices that crowned kings and funded empires were, for the people harvesting them, just another chain. Today, the battlefields are quiet, the forts overgrown. But the lesson lingers. When something as simple as flavor becomes currency, the world will bleed for it. The scent of cinnamon in your morning coffee, the black pepper on your eggs, these aren't just flavors. They're the echoes of history's first global economy. Long before container ships and stock tickers, the spice trade wove together continents in a web of interdependence so tight that a drought in Kerala could send pepper prices soaring in London, or a war in the Moluccas might leave German sausages bland for want of nutmeg. This wasn't just commerce, it was a preview of the world we live in today, where a strike in Shanghai can delay smartphones in Sao Paulo, and a virus in Wuhan can shutter shops in Warsaw. Take something as ordinary as your grocery store's spice aisle. Those neatly lined jars are the direct descendants of a system that reshaped the planet. The Dutch East India Company wasn't just a business, it was a prototype for today's multinationals, complete with shareholders, corporate espionage, and even its own private army. Its ledgers, filled with entries for cloves and cinnamon, were the blueprints for modern supply chains, tracking inventory across oceans with a precision that would make Amazon proud. And the financial instruments born from spice speculation, they evolved into the futures markets and commodity trading that now govern everything from oil to avocado toast. But the real magic lies in how spices dissolved cultural boundaries. When Portuguese sailors brought chili peppers from the Americas to India, they sparked a culinary revolution that gave us vindaloo. Arab traders carried cardamom to Scandinavia, where it became the soul of Swedish pastries. These weren't just ingredient swaps, they were the first whispers of globalization, proving that taste could travel faster than empires. Today's fusion cuisine, from kimchi tacos to curry pizza, owes its existence to those early experiments in flavor diplomacy. Yet the spice trade's darkest legacy is equally modern, the exploitation hidden behind convenience. Those Dutch nutmeg plantations in the Banda Islands operated on a brutal efficiency that foreshadowed today's sweatshops. The Portuguese forts guarding pepper routes functioned like colonial versions of Amazon warehouses, where human lives were just another line item in the ledger. Even the environmental cost feels eerily familiar. Entire ecosystems raised for monocrops, mirroring the deforestation now driven by palm oil and soy. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: globalization has always been messy, unequal, and flavored with contradictions. The same trade routes that spread cinnamon and cloves also carried disease and slavery. The financial systems that funded spice voyages later bankrolled colonialism. But they also gave us a world where a single meal can tell a story that spans continents, where saffron from Iran meets rice from Carolina in a paella pan made in China. The spice trade didn't just connect the world, it taught us that connection itself is never simple, never neutral, and always transformative. Next time you reach for that pepper grinder, remember, you're not just seasoning your dinner. You're touching the oldest network on Earth. Hidden in the shadows of your spice rack lie flavors that once made kings weep with desire. Before black pepper conquered the world, there was long pepper. Its twisted, pinecone-like spikes were so coveted that ancient Roman gourmets paid 15 times its weight in silver. This fiery cousin of modern pepper packed a complex, lingering heat that lingered on the tongue, praised by physicians from Hippocrates to Charlemagne's court. Yet by the Renaissance, it vanished from European kitchens, replaced by its rounder, milder relative. Why? Because long pepper grew only in India's remote western Ghats, and when Portuguese traders found cheaper black pepper along the Malabar coast, economics crushed tradition. Today, you might stumble upon it in an Ayurvedic shop, a ghost of gastronomy past waiting to resurrect its legacy. Then there's grains of paradise, the spice that fooled Europe. Sailing into medieval ports from West Africa, These peppery, citrus-scented seeds were peddled as a rare Indian treasure, hence the poetic name. Crusaders carried them home as proof of exotic adventures, while brewers tossed them into ale before hops were commonplace. The spice even starred in a royal scandal when England's King Henry IV taxed it to fund his wars, only for merchants to smuggle it in coffins to avoid duties. But when the Portuguese opened direct sea routes to India, the jig was up. Why pay for African paradise when real pepper flowed freely? Now, this lost jewel lingers in Moroccan Ras El Hanout blends and the occasional craft gin, its story as vibrant as its flavor. Perhaps no spice fell harder than spikenard, mentioned in the Song of Solomon and used to anoint kings in biblical times. This fragrant root from the Himalayas was the Chanel No. 5 of antiquity. Roman elites dabbed it behind their ears at orgies, while medieval monks infused it into communion oils. The catch, spikenard couldn't be cultivated. It grew wild on treacherous slopes, making it rarer than diamonds. When Marco Polo reported finding fields of it in Tibet, Venetian perfumers called him a liar. By the 17th century, overharvesting and political chaos in the Himalayas erased spikenard from Western memory. Today, a few Nepalese villages still harvest it, bottling an aroma that once defined luxury for civilizations long gone. The tragedy of these forgotten spices isn't just their disappearance, it's what we lost with them. Long pepper's medicinal compounds are now being studied for pain relief. Grains of paradise contain antioxidants that rival turmeric, and spikenard's essential oils show promise in stress reduction. Their fade into obscurity wasn't about taste, but the brutal math of colonialism and convenience. As global trade streamlined, delicate, hard-to-harvest flavors were sacrificed for cheap mass production. Rediscovering them isn't just culinary archaeology, it's a chance to taste the world as it once was, before empires flattened its diversity into a handful of supermarket staples. Next time you reach for the pepper mill, remember, history's pantry holds far more flavors than we've been taught to savor. Imagine a medieval painter carefully adding gold leaf to an altarpiece, then reaching for his most precious pigment, a vibrant yellow made from saffron, so expensive it was worth more than its weight in gold. This wasn't just art, it was a statement. Spices didn't just fill coffers, they colored the very way people saw the world. In Renaissance Europe, painters like Botticelli and Van Eyck slipped spices into their masterpieces as coded messages. A bowl of peppercorns on a merchant's table whispered of his global connections, while a single clove tucked into a still life screamed luxury. Even the Virgin Mary was often painted with a sprig of rosemary, symbolizing remembrance, or a cinnamon stick tucked into the background, hinting at divine sweetness. These weren't random details, they were visual shorthand for a society obsessed with the exotic. Literature, too, was steeped in spice. Shakespeare's plays are littered with references that would have made his audiences' mouths water or their pockets ache. In The Winter's Tale, the rogue Autolycus brags about selling nutmegs and ginger, mace and cloves, mocking the gullible buyers who paid a fortune for what was essentially flavoring. Meanwhile, in Henry IV, Falstaff's debt includes a shocking sum spent on sack and sugar, a spiced wine that was the Elizabethan equivalent of a designer cocktail. These weren't just throwaway lines, they were inside jokes about a culture drunk on imported luxuries. The East fired imaginations even more fiercely. 1001 Nights spun tales of Sinbad sailing past cinnamon-scented islands and merchants haggling over pepper in bazaars where the air itself seemed gilded. Persian poets like Hafiz compared lovers to cardamom, fragrant, complex, worth pursuing across deserts. Even Marco Polo's travelogues, often exaggerated, described Java's forests where the trees bear cloves and the leaves smell of spices when the wind blows. These stories didn't just entertain, they built myths that drove exploration, turning distant lands into fantasies of abundance. Religious rituals absorbed spices just as deeply. Frankincense and myrrh, gifted to the infant Jesus, were more than symbolic, they were among the most valuable substances on earth. Medieval churches swung censers filled with these resins, believing their smoke carried prayers heavenward. In India, turmeric sanctified weddings, while in China, Confucian scholars burned kasha bark to sharpen their minds. Spices bridged the earthly and divine, their scents acting as passports to the sacred. Fashion, too, fell under their spell. Renaissance nobles stuffed their gloves with nutmeg to mask the stench of unwashed streets, while Elizabethan dandies wore pomanders, jeweled spheres filled with cloves and ambergris around their necks like spicy armor against plague. In Mughal courts, robes were stored with sandalwood to absorb its fragrance, turning emperors into walking perfumeries. The message was clear: to smell expensive was to be powerful. Yet the most enduring cultural imprint might be the humblest, the way spices redefined daily life. The English phrase, peppercorn rent, meaning a nominal fee, comes from landlords accepting literal peppercorns as payment. Dutch still lifes of overturned spice jars warned against the vanity of wealth. Even nursery rhymes hid trade secrets. A ring around the rosy may reference the clove-studded oranges people carried to ward off disease. Spices didn't just season food, they seasoned language, art, and memory. Long after empires crumbled, their scents lingered in the collective imagination, proving that the real power of spices wasn't in their taste, but in their ability to make the whole world dream. We think of spices as flavor boosters, but for most of human history, they were something far more vital: chemical weapons in the battle against decay and disease. Take cinnamon, that warm sprinkle we associate with holiday treats. Its secret weapon is cinnamaldehyde, a compound so potent it can slaughter entire colonies of bacteria. Ancient Egyptians used cinnamon in embalming, unwittingly harnessing its antimicrobial powers to slow decomposition. Fast forward to medieval Europe, where butchers rubbed cinnamon into meat to keep it edible for weeks, long before iceboxes existed. This wasn't culinary artistry, it was food safety in an era when a bad cut of meat could kill you. Cloves tell an even more dramatic story. Their active ingredient, eugenol, numbs pain and fights infection so effectively that dentists still use it in root canals. But centuries before modern medicine, Indonesian healers chewed cloves to relieve toothaches, while European plague doctors stuffed their beaks with them, hoping to ward off miasmas. Even today, studies show clove oil can obliterate strains of E. coli and Staphylococcus, proof that those old remedies weren't just placebo. When Portuguese sailors risked scurvy and shipwreck to reach the Spice Islands, they weren't just chasing flavor, they were racing for what amounted to the penicillin of the Middle Ages. Turmeric's golden hue hides another scientific marvel: curcumin. Modern labs confirm what Ayurvedic practitioners knew millennia ago. It reduces inflammation and may even combat cancer cells. In India, turmeric paste wasn't just a cooking staple but a battlefield dressing, slathered on wounds to prevent infection. Black pepper, often paired with turmeric, isn't just a taste enhancer, its piperine boosts nutrient absorption by up to 2,000%, turning sparse medieval diets into more efficient fuel. These spices didn't just make food palatable, they transformed meager meals into survival kits. The real genius of ancient traders, they mapped these biological benefits through trial and error long before microscopes existed. Arab physicians in the 9th century prescribed ginger for nausea, not knowing its gingerol compounds relax intestinal muscles. Chinese apothecaries steeped star anise in tea centuries before scientists isolated shikimic acid, the key ingredient in Tamiflu. Every spice sack shipped across deserts or oceans carried hidden pharmaceutical value, making them the ultimate dual-purpose commodities. A single nutmeg could season a noble stew, then treat his child's fever. Yet the cruelest irony of the spice trade was this: the very preservatives that safeguarded food for long voyages couldn't protect the people harvesting them. Dutch plantation slaves in the Banda Islands died from dysentery in filthy camps, while the nutmeg they picked prevented spoilage in European pantries. The antimicrobial properties that made spices universal lifesavers couldn't shield against the germs of greed and conquest. Today, when we study these compounds in sterile labs, we're not just analyzing chemistry, we're decoding the painful paradox that shaped empires. Those tiny jars in your cabinet, they're time capsules of human ingenuity and suffering, proving that the most potent flavors in history were never just about taste, they were about the fragile line between life and death. The moment spices became currency, counterfeiters sharpened their knives. In the shadowy back alleys of medieval Venice, a sack of pure pepper could make a merchant's fortune or tempt him to cheat. Unscrupulous traders mixed precious peppercorns with juniper berries or ground-up gravel, knowing the black dust would hide their sins. Saffron, the most expensive spice by weight, was particularly vulnerable. Dishonest dealers would soak ordinary threads in honey to add heft, or worse, mix in dyed horsehair, passing it off as the real thing. The stakes were high. In 1400s Germany, selling fake saffron could earn you a sentence of being burned alive or buried alive with the fraudulent goods. Yet the risks barely dented the trade because the rewards were simply too sweet. But this wasn't just medieval mischief, it was sophisticated fraud. Merchants developed tricks worthy of alchemists. Cinnamon sticks were hollowed out and filled with sawdust, then expertly resealed with wax. Nutmegs were weighted with lead pellets before export, a deception only detectable by cracking them open. Even the elite weren't immune. King Henry VIII's household accounts reveal complaints about ginger, so mingled with sand that it would rather break a man's teeth than season his meat. The problem grew so rampant that cities appointed official pepper testers, whose job was to bite, sniff, and burn samples to detect impurities. The backlash birthed some of history's earliest consumer protection laws. In 13th century France, the Code des Épices mandated that all spices be weighed and sealed in official markets. Florence required spice sellers to swear oaths on the Bible that their goods were pure, while Nuremberg's inspectors would publicly burn adulterated shipments. But like modern regulations, enforcement was patchy. For every merchant hanged for selling chalk-dusted pepper, a dozen bribed their way out of trouble. The rich could afford the real thing, the poor made do with what they got. What's fascinating is how little has changed. Modern food labs still find lead chromate in turmeric, sawdust in oregano, and dyed corn cobs posing as sumac. The FDA estimates nearly a third of global spice shipments today contain unlisted fillers, echoing medieval ledgers where scribes lamented, "Pepper so light it floats." The methods have evolved, but the motive remains. Where there's luxury, there's someone willing to fake it. The real spice in this story isn't just the fraud, it's the enduring truth that human greed seasons every era the same way. The aroma of cloves and cinnamon didn't just linger in marketplaces, it seeped into the very words people spoke. As spices crisscrossed continents, they carried languages with them, stitching together a patchwork of communication that still shapes how we talk today. Take the humble word sugar, which traveled from Sanskrit sarkara to Arabic sakar, then to medieval Latin saccharum, before sweetening English tongues. Even orange traces its roots to the Sanskrit, Na macron R a letter 1 E4, 5G a, passed through Persian and Arabic before reaching Europe alongside the fruit itself. These weren't just vocabulary swaps. They were linguistic fingerprints of the trade routes, proof that every spice sack came with a hidden cargo of syllables and syntax. The real marvel was how trade birthed entirely new languages. In the bustling ports of Malacca and Zanzibar, a hybrid tongue called Bazaar Malay emerged, a simple, flexible mix of Malay, Arabic, and Chinese that let a Javanese pepper merchant haggle with a Persian buyer. This wasn't textbook grammar, it was survival communication stripped down to its essentials. Similar trade pidgins sprouted from the Swahili coast to the Levant, acting as linguistic stepping stones across cultures. The Dutch East India Company even published phrasebooks in Kitchen Malay, a stripped-down version for sailors to barter for nutmeg. These makeshift dialects became the WhatsApp messages of their day, fast, functional, and endlessly adaptable. But words weren't the only things changing. The spice trade forced innovations in how humans recorded information. Picture a Gujarati trader in 15th century Calicut struggling to track debts across a dozen currencies and languages. His solution, the earliest double-entry bookkeeping, meticulously noting pepper sales in ledgers that would later inspire Italian bankers. Arabic numerals, with their revolutionary concept of zero, spread along spice routes because they made calculating cargo weights infinitely easier than clunky Roman numerals. Even contracts evolved. Venetian merchants used coded abbreviations and watermarked paper to prevent spice deals from being forged, foreshadowing modern legal documents. The most unexpected legacy might be how spices shaped storytelling. Arab-D, how captains navigating by the stars passed down rhymed sailing poems called Cassidas, blending navigation tips with vivid tales of cinnamon forests guarded by winged serpents. These oral maps, memorized by generations of sailors, were as vital as compasses. Meanwhile, in Europe, spice merchants funded the first printing presses to mass-produce navigational charts, crude ancestors of today's GPS. The hunger for flavor didn't just move goods, it drove humanity to invent new ways to share knowledge, turning whispers across a marketplace into the foundation of global communication. Perhaps no artifact captures this fusion better than the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st century Greek guidebook to the Indian Ocean trade. Written by an anonymous merchant, it mixes sailing directions with cultural observations, notes on where to buy cinnamon, warnings about pirate coves, and even phrases in local languages. It wasn't literature, it was a crowdsourced travel app centuries before the concept existed. The spice trade didn't just connect ports, it built the first prototype of the information age, proving that the most valuable cargo wasn't what filled the hold, but what filled the mind. Consider the moment a Catholic priest swings a censer, sending clouds of frankincense smoke curling toward cathedral vaults. That scent, woody, sacred, almost otherworldly, hasn't changed in 2,000 years. But this isn't just ritual, it's time travel. The same resin that perfumed King Solomon's temples still bridges heaven and earth in modern worship, proving spices were never just about taste, they were the original sacred technology. Ancient Egyptians packed mummies with myrrh to guide pharaohs to the afterlife, while Hindu brides smear turmeric paste on their skin before weddings, its golden hue symbolizing purity and prosperity. These traditions share an unspoken truth. When humans sought to touch the divine, they reached for spices first. The connection runs deeper than symbolism. In Zoroastrian fire temples, sandalwood burns as an offering because its slow, steady flame represents wisdom. Tibetan Buddhists scatter saffron-infused water to bless spaces, believing its crimson threads mirror the robes of enlightened monks. Even the Bible's book of Exodus details a sacred anointing oil blended with cinnamon, cassia, and myrrh, a recipe so holy that replicating it for personal use carried a penalty of exile. What made these substances special wasn't just their rarity, but their ability to engage all five senses at once. The crackle of incense, the gleam of turmeric, the weight of peppercorns in a tithe offering, they turned abstract faith into something tangible. Perhaps nowhere is this more striking than in the ancient Silk Road city of Palmyra, where archaeologists uncovered invoices for cinnamon and ginger buried beside temple altars. These weren't spices for eating, they were invoices for the gods, literal receipts proving worshippers paid for divine favor with the most precious commodities on earth. Similarly, in medieval Europe, churches stockpiled pepper as currency to buy indulgences, turning a pantry staple into spiritual collateral. The line between marketplace and altar blurred until they became one and the same. Yet the most enduring sacred spice might be the humblest, salt. Roman soldiers were paid in it, hence the word salary. But it also purified sacrifices in Jewish tradition and sealed covenants in cultures from Japan to the Americas. When Jesus called his followers the salt of the earth, he wasn't just speaking metaphorically. He was invoking a substance everyone knew carried both practical and mystical power. This duality captures the heart of spice spirituality, the mundane and the miraculous, ground together like mortar and pestle. Today's scientists might explain these traditions with chemistry. Frankincense's psychoactive compounds reduce anxiety. Turmeric's anti-inflammatory properties aid healing. But ancient cultures needed no labs to recognize spices as conduits between realms. When a Shinto priest waves a cinnamon branch to cleanse a shrine, or a Coptic Christian stirs myrrh into communion wine, they're participating in a chain of reverence stretching back to the dawn of trade. The real miracle isn't that spices crossed continents. It's that they convinced every civilization along the way they were worth dying for, praying with, and preserving across millennia. The gods may change, but the aromas linger. Today's spice trade moves at the speed of shipping containers and algorithms, a far cry from the creaking wooden ships and camel caravans of antiquity. A single modern cargo vessel can carry enough black pepper to supply every supermarket in Europe for months, while drones monitor turmeric fields in India for pests, relaying data to farmers' smartphones. The numbers are staggering. Global spice exports now top $10 billion annually, with vanilla and saffron still commanding prices that rival silver. But beneath this high-tech efficiency lies an industry grappling with the ghosts of its past and the urgent demands of the future. Fair trade certifications have emerged as a powerful counterforce to historical exploitation. In Madagascar, vanilla farmers, once at the mercy of volatile prices, now sell directly to chocolatiers through cooperatives, their beans traceable via blockchain from orchid to extract. The shift is palpable. A farmer in Kerala who once earned pennies for his family's peppercorns can now scan a QR code on a supermarket jar and see his own face credited as the grower. Yet for all this progress, reports still surface of enslaved workers on Brazilian nutmeg plantations or child labor in Indonesian maize fields. The modern spice trade wears two faces, one gleaming with innovation, the other shadowed by old, unresolved injustices. Climate change has rewritten the rules of cultivation entirely. Cardamom plants in Guatemala now struggle with unpredictable rains, while rising temperatures in Iran's saffron belt threaten to have yields by 2050. Scientists race to develop drought-resistant pepper vines, but some heirloom varieties, like the rare wild cinnamon of Sri Lanka's rainforests, may vanish before solutions are found. Paradoxically, the very spices that once fueled empires now depend on human mercy to survive. In Zanzibar, clove farmers adapt by reviving ancient intercropping techniques, planting cloves alongside mango trees to mimic natural ecosystems. It's a return to wisdom the spice trade forgot in its rush toward monocultures. The most revolutionary change, transparency. Apps like Spice Chain let consumers follow their cumin from Rajasthan field to taco seasoning blend, exposing every handler and chemical used along the way. Luxury brands now hawk single-origin nutmeg with terroir profiles as detailed as Bordeaux wines, while chefs demand spices harvested at precise lunar phases for optimal flavor. This obsession with traceability would astonish a Venetian merchant. His pepper sacks blended from a dozen unknown sources now seem as archaic as alchemy. Yet the echoes of history persist. When a cyclone wipes out a vanilla crop in Madagascar, prices skyrocket just as they did when Dutch nutmeg warehouses burned in the 1600s. The players have changed. Multinationals replace monarchs. Hedge funds speculate on pepper futures instead of Medici bankers, but the dance of scarcity and desire remains the same. The real question isn't whether the spice trade has evolved, but whether humanity can finally break the cycle of exploitation that seasoned its rise. For now, every pinch of paprika holds the answer: progress, yes, but still simmering with the bittersweet taste of the past. The spice trade once shaped empires, but its future hinges on something far more delicate: balance. As global demand soars, the industry faces a critical crossroads: how to feed the world's appetite for flavor without exhausting the soils and communities that produce it. Enter vertical farming, where stacks of hydroponic trays grow basil and saffron in urban warehouses under LED suns. A single Amsterdam facility now produces more organic mint annually than 100 traditional farms, using 95% less water. Meanwhile, in Singapore, skyscraper greenhouses cultivate climate-resilient pepper vines, their roots misted by AI-driven systems that mimic monsoon showers. This isn't just farming, it's alchemy, turning concrete jungles into spice forests. Yet technology alone isn't the answer. In Kerala's fading pepper groves, a quiet revolution unfolds as farmers revive pre-colonial agroforestry. Instead of monocultures, they plant pepper vines alongside mango trees and coffee shrubs, creating ecosystems where each plant nourishes the others. The results are staggering: soil regeneration, pest resistance, and peppercorns so potent they've caught the attention of Michelin-starred chefs. Blockchain seals the deal, with QR codes on every packet tracing the journey from vine to table, ensuring fair wages and organic integrity. One cooperative even broadcasts live from the fields, letting buyers virtually tour the gardens where their black gold grows. Lost spices are also staging a comeback, rescued from obscurity by chefs turned historians. In Copenhagen's Noma lab, foragers experiment with bog myrtle, a medieval spice abandoned when black pepper arrived. Its piney citrus notes now star in avant-garde dishes, while pharmaceutical companies study its anti-inflammatory properties. Similarly, Ethiopian kararima, a cardamom cousin once traded along ancient incense routes, is being tested as a natural preservative to replace synthetic additives. Even the long-forgotten grains of paradise are reappearing, not just in craft breweries, but in labs where their compounds show promise for treating metabolic disorders. The most unexpected frontier, space. NASA lunar greenhouse prototypes include compact spice modules, recognizing that a sprinkle of oregano or cumin could be the key to astronauts' mental health on Mars missions. Closer to home, bioengineers in California are coaxing vanilla flavor from genetically modified yeast, offering a sustainable alternative to deforestation-heavy vanilla farms. And in Germany, researchers extract chili capsaicin to create biodegradable antifreeze for solar panels, proof that spices might cool the planet as effectively as they once heated global trade. The future of spices isn't just about preserving the past, it's about reimagining their role in a world grappling with climate crisis and cultural amnesia. From blockchain-tagged turmeric fighting rural poverty to AI-optimized greenhouses shrinking carbon footprints, the next chapter of this ancient trade is being written in labs, forests, and even outer space. The scents that once lured explorers across oceans now beckon us toward something equally audacious, a future where flavor doesn't come at the cost of the earth but helps heal it. The spice routes of tomorrow won't be drawn on maps, they'll be woven into the very fabric of sustainability, one fragrant innovation at a time. The scent of cinnamon on your morning toast or the black pepper dusting your pasta isn't just seasoning, it's the ghost of empires whispering across centuries. Those unassuming jars in your kitchen are the last survivors of an era when flavor could topple kingdoms, fund revolutions, and redraw maps. Think about the humble nutmeg, once so coveted that nations traded islands for it like chess pieces, or saffron threads worth more than their weight in gold, stashed in royal treasuries alongside jewels. These weren't just ingredients, they were the original building blocks of globalization, stitching continents together long before the internet or airplanes. What's astonishing isn't just the scale of the spice trade, it's how deeply it rewired human civilization. The Dutch East India Company didn't just ship cloves, it invented modern capitalism, complete with stock markets and corporate monopolies. The Portuguese caravels that rounded Africa weren't merely exploring, they were hacking the world's economic code, bypassing centuries-old trade networks with brute force and cannons. Even the Silk Road, famous for silk, owed its resilience to the spice merchants who kept its caravanserais thriving when other luxuries faltered. Every major leap in navigation, finance, or diplomacy for half a millennium had spice fingerprints all over it. Yet the true legacy lies in the collisions these routes sparked. When chili peppers from the Americas landed in India, they didn't just heat up curries, they birthed entirely new cuisines. Arabic numerals carried along spice routes revolutionized European mathematics. The very concept of credit, born from Venetian spice deals, became the backbone of modern banking. Even the word salary traces back to Roman soldiers paid in salt, another precious commodity traded like spice. This wasn't just commerce, it was cultural DNA splicing, remixing ideas across continents with every ship that sailed. And the irony, the empires that fought most viciously for control of these flavors often missed their true value. The Portuguese burned cinnamon forests to manipulate prices, never imagining the medicinal compounds they were destroying. The Dutch enslaved entire populations for nutmeg, blind to the ecological wisdom of the Bandanese who'd cultivated it sustainably for generations. In their hunger for profit, they treated spices as lifeless commodities when in reality, they were living bridges between worlds, carrying not just taste but knowledge, tradition, and connection. So the next time you shake paprika into a stew or steep a chai tea bag, pause for a second. That simple act ties you to Phoenician sailors braving monsoons, to medieval apothecaries grinding remedies, to enslaved laborers whose names history forgot but whose hands shaped the flavors we take for granted. The spice trade didn't just fade into history, it dissolved into it, leaving behind a world where borders blur in every bite and a pinch of pepper carries the weight of centuries. The routes may be silent now, but their echoes linger in the most ordinary moments, reminding us that the smallest things can reshape